Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Richard Wendorf, the Stanford Calderwood Director and Librarian of the Boston Athenaeum, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this lecture and book signing. Now, before we get started, I want to take just a moment to remind those of you who have cell phones on you to make sure that you've turned them off. Should we have an alarm of any kind during this event, I want to remind you that those of you in the front of the room will exit with me through these doors, and those of you in the back of the room would go out the door that's back by the restrooms and the children's library. None of us will exit the way we came in through the front doors. I'd also like to point out that this lecture is being taped, and it will be rebroadcast here tomorrow at noon, as usual, and it will also be available on the WGBH Forum Network. Well, what a great pleasure it is to welcome back Dominique Browning to the Boston Athenaeum. This is the third talk she's given here in 3 years. They have been wonderful, wonderful, exquisite talks, readings, based on the two marvelous books she's published. The first, Around the House and in the Garden, a memoir of heartbreak, healing, and home improvement. One of my favorite subtitles ever, I think. And then Paths of Desire, the passions of a suburban gardener. I think you all know that Dominique Browning has been the editor-in-chief of House and Garden since 1995. Essentially transforming a much beloved but somewhat moribund magazine into what I think we can easily say is the most lively, most interesting, and best written and best edited magazine of its kind in the country. Today she's with us to talk about a new book that she and the editors of House and Garden have just published called The New Garden Paradise, Great Private Gardens of the World, a book that takes us on a private tour of 35 of the world's most exquisite examples of what the blurb calls cutting-edge garden design. That makes me think of cutting in, and I really, really have tremors down my spine when I think of that. But nonetheless, it gives me great pleasure to welcome back Dominique Browning to the Boston Athenaeum.
Thank you so much for those kind words. It's really lovely to be back here, too. This is one of my favorite rooms in the world. You are all so lucky to be able to come here and just read your newspaper in the morning. I'm very envious. Well, I'm going to make a very large boast about this book, but I'm going to make it anyway, even though it is bragging. There will be never be another book like this one. And that is actually because gardens are an evanescent art form. They are vulnerable to the vagaries of weather, to the moodiness of plants, to the attention spans and budgets of their owners. It's only in a photographic record that there's any permanence to the existence of a garden. The gardens in this book lie behind high walls or locked gates or at the end of long drives, and they're places to which the privileged few are invited. Gardens and gardeners tend to thrive in a world far removed from press agents and the general public. The editors of House and Garden rely on word-of-mouth recommendations to find them. We hear about people going to a party at a wonderful garden. We run into designers who tell us about what they're working on, and we faithfully dog their steps, nagging them until they let us come in with their cameras, our cameras. We're now the only magazine that devotes serious resources to covering the garden world. I'm very lucky to be editing at Condé Nast, where I can spend the money and have the editors and the photographers to do the kind of garden photography that we think a beautiful book requires. This book is the result of 10 years of shooting, and I should tell you, when we send people out on garden shoots, we send an editor, we send a photographer, And they have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning because that is when the light is good. They're not photographing from noon till about 3. They photograph again at the end of the day. We usually go back to gardens several times during the year so that we can see different seasons. So you can see it's a lot of energy and money put into covering this world. And that's why the book was born, because I thought, I love magazines, I'm a magazine person, but let's face it, at the end of the month, you go to a new one. And it seemed a shame to lose the record of such work as has gone into these gardens, the design, the planting of them. So we decided to put it together in a book. Then, of course, to find a publisher who wanted to do a garden book, but that's another story. We're living in a time of enormous creativity in the garden design world. In the last decade, there's been a happy confluence at work, a really robust economy, and a generation of patrons who are primed to invest in their estates, and a dazzling array of design stars who can now be supported to do their work. This has led to an unprecedented amount of activity in the garden world. These gardens in this book are estate gardens. They're large, they're owned by wealthy patrons, and they take a lot of work both to plant and to maintain. But I think they're very valuable for those of us who have modest gardens at home, and of course for those of us who just love gardens. In every single one of these gardens, there are corners or plant combinations or design ideas that anybody could take into their gardens. So it's fun to look at work. I always say about design and about architecture, when you want to learn about great work, you don't go to the flea market, you go to a museum, or you go look at the work of great patrons of architecture or decorating or gardening. And I think that's how you really learn about design, to look at great work. Our book is international in scope, but I just want to make the point that the amount of garden design and the creativity and power of the design happening in this country now is also unprecedented. And for the first time, I think in the history of garden design, European designers are looking to America to see what's going on, rather than the other way around, where we were copying what was going on in Europe. Gardeners tend to be the kind of people who love to classify. They love to put things in order. And looking out at the landscape of the new garden world, we felt the same need to classify in our book. So we've divided it into 7 parts: the new classicism, the new traditionalism, the new naturalism, the plantsman, personal visions, the cottage garden reinvented, and the new modernism. So you can get a sense here about the range that we're covering. It's not all really cutting edge, but it is all new interpretations of old forms. Today, I'm just going to give you a little sense of what's happening in the world of garden design. Oh, this, by the way, is actually one of my favorite garden design pictures, and it is from a garden in California designed for Larry Ellison of Oracle by Ron Herman. A beautiful patchwork quilt across the front of the yard of these stones and this tiny little baby moss. The new classicism. We're seeing a new classical style that's inspired by the architectural principles of the ancients: balance, harmony, and unity. A classical style requires discipline, devotion, and above all, restraint, editing. This is a garden made in Spain by Fernando Caruncho. You could recognize it with your eyes closed. The perfume of 3 acres of lavender, the buzzing of tens of thousands of bees collecting nectar. All of Caruncho's work is about man's partnership with the land. This is on Spain's Costa Brava, and it was built on the site of a former farm. It was one of Caruncho's first commissions. He was 23 years old when he designed this. He was born with garden design in his blood, I think. He decided to limit his palette to local agricultural standbys, using grasses, grapes, and cypress trees. Corincho is a former student of philosophy, and he continues to draw inspiration from the ancients. He centers this garden on mirrors, an arrangement of 4 rectangular pools whose surfaces reflect the daily passage of the sun. Parterres of wheat are balanced by platoons of gnarled olives. The wheat adds its own rhythm to the garden, from the bright green tips poking through the dull ground in early spring to the drying bales which are left around after autumn's harvest. On another site, a cliff overlooking the Mediterranean, Corincho built a water garden with umbrella pines and massive basalt boulders set around a complex of rectilinear lily pools. The play of light on the water brings this garden to life. If gardens made music, Corincho's creations would ring with fugues. If there were a soundtrack to this presentation, you would probably be listening to Bach's Goldberg variations. And if Corincho plays Bach, Jacques Wirtz plays Brubeck. Wirtz, working in Belgium, is a master of the hedge, using simple green lines to trace the undulations of the fields of his gardens. This is another angle, actually, from our cover shot. Wirtz compares his work to musical compositions. He believes that gardens have the same abstract power to arouse strong emotional response. The beech hedges that swirl around the house in this garden form an enormous G clef. This was to honor the fact that Wirtz met the patron of this garden at a classical music concert. They share a passion for music. This garden has profound seasonal pleasures. Hawthorns are covered with flowers in the late spring, and the coppery beech leaves of the hedges cling to gray twigs throughout the long winter. In another garden, Wirtz created twin bosques, formalized rectangular woods of hornbeams planted in geometric groupings of 5. The patterns bring the trees so close that their branches interlace. You can see them sort of floating in the middle of the slide there. They're clipped around the exterior to create what look like floating blocks of geometry. For Wirtz, a garden must have a sense of mystery. It must unfold slowly before your eyes. You must feel you are discovering it. Douglas Reed makes the trees dance. This is a garden on Long Island, and it proves that classical design doesn't have to have a stiff formality. When Reed first saw this property, he found more than 100 century-old trees, but the place was a mess. The topography, though, consisted of a long valley with a striking knoll at its western corner. The clients had built a graceful but austere house. Reed reacted to the lines counterintuitively. He adopted a flowing and lyrical line that suits the curvaceous character of the site rather than designing around the house. There's the house, set on a pedestal, which he did, with a grass terrace edged in stone, so that the striking structure looks almost like a piece of sculpture, and it almost is part of the garden in that it's its central feature. He collaborated with the architect on pools, and he designed a minimalist-style fence of stainless steel rods, which you can see weaving through the back there. No railings, just posts sunk into the earth. Those posts echo the close-set trunks in a nearby stand of densely planted sassafras trees. A fountain passes through a wall to spill down the stepping stones that lead to the pool house. This collaboration between architect and designer of garden is extremely important and unfortunately doesn't happen very often. And I think it makes for a much more cohesive sense of both architecture and garden when the two have worked hand in hand. The owner is the former dancer, and she's now a patron of dance. She talks about the choreographers who have visited her house, each one feeling compelled to design a dance in the garden. Twyla Tharp envisioned an audience on the knoll with the house as a backdrop. Merce Cunningham imagined a dancer with trees as a backdrop. Everybody responds a different way. A new traditionalism. There's a special genius to finding new virtues in a centuries-old tradition. A French garden suited the French-inspired house of Deborah Nevins's Midwest clients. It also suited their family's needs. André Lenotre was garden maker to Louis XIV and creator of the classical French garden tradition. He had a talent for filling his clients with a sense of power. Nevins's clients weren't interested in power, though. They were interested in empowerment. The emphasis on formal walks, terraces, and alleys in this garden promised easy mobility to a child who uses a wheelchair and a walker. This is a barrier-free garden that's not at all obviously so. It's a garden the whole family can enjoy on an equal footing. It's respectful of the architecture of the house. Nevins is not only a designer, she's also an architectural historian and a former lecturer on landscape history, so she has a very refined sense of the context of a garden. Nevins began by articulating the spaces around the house. She created a series of clearly defined chambers. She used a mellow York stone for pavers, which connected to the house and provide good traction. This is the amphitheater, enclosed with a banked massive box, painstakingly hand-pruned, which if you have box, you can imagine the labor, hand-pruned to preserve the quality of billowing green clouds. Each space offers a different experience. Paths are kept wide enough to accommodate two people moving side by side. At the edge of the highly structured spaces, Nevins shifts to a less formal surface, decomposed granite sprayed with a binder called stabilizer to ensure a non-slip surface. Here, tree trunks form a portico of columns shading the path. The straight edges are blurred with an underplanting of hostas, astilbes, and ferns. People are at the door. Come in, please. Plantings at the edges tend to extravagant tides and drifts of color, such as a tapestry of bluebells, hellebores, and miniature narcissi that bloom by an alley of locust trees in the spring. In the traditional French garden, the sun rose and set around the king. In this Illinois garden, the formal tradition has a new kind of humanity. Of course, tradition can be a trap. Yoji Sasaki, one of Japan's leading and most innovative landscape designers, has expressed deeply conflicted feelings on the subject of traditionalism. He practices in a country whose cultural heritage is vital. He can't ignore the past. The strength of tradition, though, is what makes it a challenge for him. He respects it, and yet he's adamant about maintaining his creative independence. Sasaki was trained at Berkeley and then later at the Harvard School of Design, and it was as an outsider in the U.S. that he began to explore Japanese tradition. This picture is from a garden made for the official residence of the Speaker of Japan's House of Representatives. Sasaki's job was to make a typically Japanese garden that would accommodate the speaker's need for entertaining in a Western style. Here, two traditions interlace in a path. Fingers of Western-style turf reach out between cut stone pavers to touch those of native Japanese pebble pavement. The garden's principal path divides the two experiences. To the right, a lawn for Western-style entertaining, the garden as a center of activity. To the left, a garden for quiet thought, an interpretation of the famous sand and moss gardens in the Japanese tradition of gardens as works of art. Sasaki's father was a minimalist painter, and I think you can see his influence on the design of his son's garden. This path leads a meditational walk straight down to and then right into the water of a restored pond. I've never seen anything like this. I thought it was brilliant. The gray cut stone slabs are set on edge like neatly parallel corduroy, and the fish swim in and out between the pavers, making a very beautiful tableau when you're at the water's edge. Reduction is a central part of Sasaki's style. Not busy, but quiet is his goal. This is a garden he created around his own house just outside Osaka. Clean, white walls become the screen on which the garden elements are projected as the sun crosses the sky. You can imagine the shadows cast by the graceful stalks of bamboo or by the geometry of the wall. The entry is made through an austere, glass-enclosed foyer, minimally ornamented with horsetails and one single maple. The transparent walls of the foyer bring the garden right into the house. Every object outside is as carefully chosen and placed as those inside. Simple things take on dignity and power. Here, the tradition of stillness lives on in our very busy century. Naturalism is the gardener's interpretation of nature, an attempt to abstract themes and principles from the details of the landscape around him and then work with them. This is a fascinating kind of gardening to me because it's one of the most difficult styles to master. It's also one of the most difficult styles to understand. One of our favorites of the new naturalists is Californian William Peters, and in our book we focus on a garden in Sun Valley, Idaho. The landscape looks untouched, but the grove of aspens that surround the house were planted to define the landscape's spaces. They're periodically replaced and moved as they outgrow their spots. The first-time visitor looks around and wonders, where's the garden? The cut granite monoliths are by the late Texas-based sculptor Jesus Morales. The simplicity of the cobbled path demonstrates the owner's sympathy with the Rocky Mountain landscape. Another path, called Williams Walk, runs through the sagebrush. Peters used the contours of the land to pace the stroll. When the path approaches a view that he didn't really want you to look at, he turned it uphill or downhill, and that forces you to look at your feet to pay attention to where you're going. When the path flattens, the view becomes much more appealing. These devices direct the eye from the town below to the superb peaks that fill the horizon. The rugged stones that you see placed in the back and then in the foreground were purchased from a local mining claim, and the owner says they thought she was insane when she showed up with a couple of $100 to buy some rocks. But they really do a great job of borrowing from the mountainside and bringing that into the garden. These sculptures were acquired in Korea, and they've settled easily into the Idaho mountainside. And I love the idea of bringing things home from your travels, not just for your house, but to also put into your garden to remind you as you walk about where you've been. White Sierra granite pavers lend a finished look to a path near the house, but they also fit the rugged mountain setting. Flushes of color from the wildflowers turn the garden orange, yellow, or blue. The sagebrush that you see in the background has been groomed and deadwood removed. The coarsest of the wild grasses have been weeded out, gotten rid of. The landscape has been gradually refined, but Peters's goal was to leave the visitor wondering what exactly was done. Very light hand on the landscape. There's a real value in looking at gardens taken to the extreme, and I would say these are your cutting-edge gardens. These are the kinds of gardens that make people ask, well, what is a garden anyway? They turn questions of plantsmanship and composition on their heads. They make us think and wonder, and they come, I think, from a very deep place in the gardener's soul. This garden is in LA. It was designed by Vietnamese-born Andrew Cao. For Cao, the act of creation was as much an exorcism as a celebration. He was haunted by the lost landscapes of his childhood, and he wanted to resurrect their beauty. He built this garden for himself, as he could find no other client when he began his practice. And he certainly couldn't find somebody who would agree to make a garden out of recycled glass, which is what this is. This is tiny, 1,500 square feet, and it is unforgettable. Here we see cones of recycled glass raked up into these shapes that recall the luminous cones of salt that Cao remembers watching workers rake up from the brine when he was a child. The glass glitters in the sun by day and glows in the moonlight. He caught the feel of flooded rice paddies with Mexican feather grass that rises out of a ground of cobalt blue glass. A glass-encrusted boundary wall evokes the coast of his childhood memories. Gold and green fragments of glass on black represent rice drying on the tarmac of Vietnamese highways. The handful of dramatic plants that Cow chose to include, tropicals such as epidendrum orchids, gingers, and bananas, show off like gems in this setting. Not everything is idyllic along Highway 1. A rusted steel sculpture recalls the abandoned armaments that lay along the route. The beauty of this garden is allegorical, but it's also quite literal. It's a transporting place. It has a sense of tranquility and mystery. The visitor feels almost a weightlessness, as if the garden were floating on a tide of light. Sadly, this book proves my boast at the beginning of this lecture about there not being another book like this. This garden no longer exists. After he was published in House and Garden, Cow immediately got some rather fantastic commissions to do big, gorgeous gardens, and he could finally afford to move into a little bit more space. And the new owner of the house didn't want this garden anymore, and so it was destroyed. Thank goodness we have a record of it. The most personal of gardens, like this one in Texas by Martha Schwartz, who teaches up here actually at Harvard, they're fun to see because their designers wear their eccentricities on their sleeves. But they also give you an inoculation against complacency. After you visit one, you're likely to catch yourself looking down the endless vista of America's foundation plantings and chemically enhanced turf and wonder which one is the folly. Garden design today reaches across such a wide range, the personal range with its glass and metal and all sorts of unnatural materials. It's radical. I'm going to close with a garden that beautifully grows out of one of our more familiar expectations of what a garden should feel like. This one is made by the grande dame of English garden design, Penelope Hobhouse. And as she points out, she is 1/4 American. This was a crucial credential for this transatlantic project. The client wanted an Edwardian English estate, but he wanted it on 560 acres he owned in northwestern Connecticut. To take the property back a century in time and across an ocean would seem to require magic, or at least science fiction. But Hobhouse accomplished this translation through simple horticultural know-how. Though it may appear like an invitation to dream, this wooden gate actually provides access to the cutting garden that furnishes flowers, herbs, fruits, and vegetables for the owner's 2 residences. A spring display of Apeldoorn, General Eisenhower, and Rembrandt tulips. Chickens are here indeed free range, but they are decorative, like flowers. A patterned brick path marks the central axis of the walled formal garden, and a bench at the end there marks the termination. The brick wall keeps the deer out, which is absolutely necessary in Connecticut as they are ravaging the countryside. But it also makes a typically English enclosure, and for those of you who know English gardens, this is the kind of scene you see over and over set into the landscape. A rustic Russian house purchased at an auction now sits in the cottage garden all its own, cut out of the surrounding woods. Self-sufficiency is a goal as the garden evolves. The owners produce their own fruits and vegetables. A late summer border in the formal garden, Nepeta, verbena, bloom in front of the white hydrangea, this is grandiflora, and phlox. The green and white set off the purples of the buddleia and eupatorium. This is a classic English look, but well suited to the climate of the northwestern Connecticut. You can see here Ducat dill in its chartreuse starbursts around the bottom of the screen, perfectly complementing the intense blues of Pacific Giant and Round Table delphiniums, another English favorite that do well here. Paired pavilions, and to the rear a pergola, all by British architect Sir Anthony Denny, lend a decorous English flavor to this Yankee landscape. A gaggle of Chinese geese steps out across a turf bridge towards a double alley of Zelkovas, the approach to a folly, which you can see just in the distance there on the horizon. And that's our tour of garden design today. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions anybody might have, or talk about the book, or anything you would like. Yes?
The horsetails. I want to know, how do you plant horsetails? Are they, I only know them wild.
Oh, no, you can buy them and plant them. I'm not sure they do well in our... the question was about horsetail, a kind of grass, which is available now. One of the interesting things that's happened in the last even 5 years among nurseries is a sudden passion for grasses and things that were much, much harder to get even 5 or 6 years ago. They're now propagated. You can go online and find nurseries who will send it right to you. It's a very dramatic, thick stalk of grass, which I've actually seen in California gardens.
It goes back to the Carboniferous.
I'm sorry?
It goes back to the Carboniferous, and you can find the fossils.
Yeah.
But also you can find these in Blue Hill. You can find them in the North Shore.
Oh, fabulous. Really? Yeah. Huh. Well, that's nice to know. Anything else? Yes? No, I don't know. And of course, it looks like it should have been designed by Olmsted or something. It has that wonderful curving character. I don't really think there was a designer. I think that there were just a lot of trees that had been untended for such a long time that they were able to grow up so beautifully. They're not specimens necessarily. Sassafras, for example, is a fairly rampant tree that self-seeds, I guess, and actually grows by runners. And I think the gift there was to find that kind of wooded property and to recognize what was special, and rather than, cut everything down and start with a blank slate, to respect what had been there and to really bring forward the character. I think we would have heard if there had been a major designer behind, and I think that would have changed what the owners would have done had it been a really special, garden beforehand. Yes?
For every garden you publish, there must be many that you decide not to publish. Is there anything that you learned from that latter group about what not to do?
The question was about the gardens that we have not published. No, basically by the time we publish a garden in House and Garden, it has been through quite a high series of barriers for quality and for design and for plantsmanship. We have editors who really know what they're doing with gardens. And as I said before, I really believe in bringing to the pages great architecture, great design of gardens, because I don't really want to open a magazine and see my house. I can see that in my neighborhood. I really want to see things that are beautifully accomplished, because I think I can really learn from that. And I think as a reader, it gives you the privilege of going into places that you wouldn't normally get to see. So the gardens that we left out of the book really were because we didn't want to just do a pretty picture book. We had a very ambitious goal for this book, which was that we would say something, I don't want to sound too high-flown, but we would say something that had some intellectual strength to it about what we were doing. We really tried to categorize what was happening in landscape design, and so we used gardens to illustrate those points. There are a lot of beautiful gardens that aren't really either one or the other. And we tried to show examples that would really clearly make the point of a naturalist garden or a cottage garden. There are tons of lessons about what not to do, but generally you can drive around and see those. Yes? My garden. I wrote about my garden in my last book, Paths of Desire, and it's not a garden that I would photograph for the magazine necessarily, because it doesn't have any kind of rigor in terms of its design, and I wrote about it in a different way, and in fact didn't use any photographs, God forbid. But I certainly learned a lot from doing my own garden. And I would say that my attraction is for the more naturalist kind of gardens and woodland gardens. And probably my favorite gardens in the book are the ones right at the very beginning by Coruncho, because I've never seen anything like those gardens. They're so dramatic in Spain. And 3 acres of lavender. I can't even get 3 lavender bushes to go at the same time. So, amazing. Yes?
Do you have any tips for people who try to build gardens that are competing with deer, aside from building a wall around the house?
You know what? It's horrible. I mean, I think that this is one of my soapboxes. I really do believe that in 10 or 15 years, people are going to look back and say, what was the matter with everybody that they let this epidemic happen? Because that's really what's going on. They're ravaging the forests, eating through sapling, second growth, third growth. It's really, really terrible destruction. And there is nothing you can do except put up fences. There's just nothing else. I have friends who have tried everything. You read constantly about mixes of things and cat pee and mothballs and everything. None of it works. Human hair, it doesn't work. You really have to put up very, very high fences, really 8 or 9 foot fences to keep them out. And I think walled gardens are the way to go if you want to keep. And if you are creating a garden where there was nothing, another idea is to have a lower walled garden, but a sunken garden, to bring your garden down from the level of your lawn, because they won't jump into something that is lower, I think. At least if they get in, they can't get out, and you come into your garden. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work. There are a lot of evergreens that they will eat. Everything that they have been known not to eat 10 years ago, they now eat. It's incredible. They evolve incredibly rapidly to respond to the salad bar that is your yard. So, I guess just like we eat arugula, who used to eat arugula, they eat, conifers, even though they didn't used to. So, it's bad. Yes? Yeah.
You said that he became hugely, successful afterwards. Have you ever photographed any gardens that he's designed since then, and what are they like?
This is the young Vietnamese born gardener, and how has his style evolved? You can still recognize his fingerprints. He has not replicated that garden, of course, but he still works out of a very deeply imaginative and kind of an eccentric place. The glass element he has still played with, continued to play with. We've photographed a couple of gardens of his that he's done almost as demonstration gardens in public areas. And there's one garden I'm dying to get my hands on, but the owner just will not let us in. And, sometimes it takes years, and sometimes people never let us in. He is successful and still a very, very lovely and modest person. Success in garden design world does not mean fabulous riches, really, but for him, I think the success of being given a lot of space and the patronage to pay for doing what he does, I think is quite wonderful. Yes?
Obviously, this is an ongoing project. How many years, and where did you begin? You have people, fielded in different parts of the world, I assume. It's just amazing, very interesting project.
Thank you. The question is about the process of putting the book together, and we did draw on 10 years worth of gardens, more from the later years as we knew what we were doing more. But we also, as I pulled it together, realized we didn't have anything from Japan. We didn't have anything from Germany. We were missing some designers who we thought we would get to eventually, but because of the book, we went and photographed them. So my garden editors really are two people who go out on shoots, and they do travel the world. And they also travel extensively in this country. And so we had a lot to draw on, and after 10 years, had a feeling about where we were going and what we wanted to do with the book. I will say everybody was ready to shoot me at the end of it. But it's like having a baby. You go through a lot of pain, through labor, and now that the book is here, everybody is so happy to have it, and they've all forgotten the pain. So we're doing another one. We're actually doing a book which will come out I think it'll come out this year sometime. We have a column in the magazine called Houses of Worship, and the idea there is to study the spiritual nature of architecture, the places that people make that are meant for worship or contemplation all over the world again, but mostly in this country. So that'll be a collection of those pieces too. A little advance plug. Thank you very, very much for joining me.